Hello and welcome to Leadership Ripples with Leah Fink. Every action that you take as a leader has a ripple effect, impacting not only your team and your organization, but even going out into people's personal lives. On this show, we use real stories and questions from leaders like yourself so we can learn, grow, and ultimately create the kind of ripples that we want for the people in our lives. Please feel free to comment and ask questions, especially if you're watching live. Even if we're not live anymore, feel free to put those questions in the comment bar and I can make sure to get back to you. If you're a regular listener and have been enjoying the show, I would certainly appreciate it if you could go to your favorite podcast app. You can find the link for that in the description and leave us a rating or a review, as it really helps this show get out to more people. And finally, I want to thank our regular listeners for your patience. I have been out sick the last couple weeks with not a very good voice for recording a vocal show. And so I appreciate your patience as I get back to this. Now, today we're going to be talking about some of the challenges and differences in leading remote and hybrid teams, especially if you were used to previously leading teams in person. RL writes in with their question. I have worked in various leadership roles in my company for almost 15 years. During the pandemic, my team went fully remote and we're now on a hybrid schedule, where staff are in the office 2 days a week and remote the other 3. It took a while to find flow with the remote work and with the hybrid work, but it never got to the same level as when we were in person. And everything just seems to work better when the team is in the office as opposed to the days when they're remote. Communication is easier when we don't have to message through email and Slack and Teams. There's more trust in their work when I can support them more directly. Training is easier when everyone is together, and people pay more attention in meetings instead of being muted and black screened as they run errands. Just everything. I find myself trying to schedule everything important into those 2 days, but then they often feel too packed. Should we try to move to 3 days in the office instead? Do you have any suggestions? So thank you for your question, RL. And I think a lot of leaders, especially over the last couple of years, have also experienced some of the challenges you're probably facing. And it makes sense because the whole way that we worked shifted into something potentially totally new, completely different to what you were used to. And we had to find these new ways of working and we had to integrate new technology, maybe to a place where there was almost no technology before. It was a big shift. And I've talked with a lot of leaders of companies or within organizations that have struggled with this idea of staying remote versus back in the office versus some sort of hybrid, because a lot of leadership and especially executive level in the organization have a bit more of a preference for in-person work. And there's some different reasons for that. They seem to see it working better. Whereas most of the advocacy I see for remote or hybrid work tends to come from employees who have a personal preference and benefit that they see to it. So often this discussion and this decision becomes around making leadership happy versus keeping employees happy. And employees and leadership have different priorities and they have different needs. And so it makes sense that there's going to be a little bit of this clash and a little bit of figuring out to do when you think about what am I going to do? What makes the most sense for my organization? But let's start by going into the overarching challenge of this whole idea, which is what happens with office culture when there's a big change. And today we're talking more about when that change goes to remote or hybrid from in person, but really this can apply to any big change in your organization. If you merge with someone, if you have a whole bunch of staff coming in at the same time, they're actually very applicable in a very similar way. Because we don't realize how much of our culture and how much of our way of working is so incidental. We often develop them without any real intention or planning about how these things work. They just build over time and then we believe that they are the way things should be. And that's a really natural process. If you think about how a lot of businesses are formed, you have one person that's a founder, maybe a small group of people, and they develop everything based on their preference and what's easy. So they don't think about it so much as culture as just, yeah, we're working together really well. And they often don't think about things like culture until they get more and more employees, and they have to start defining some of these pieces, to start defining some systems. So, for example, the way of communication in a company may be that the founder liked to communicate a certain way with everyone. And so then all the people he worked with in that original staff team started communicating that way with their teams. And those team members then communicated that way with their teams as you got more and more layers of people in the organization, until it's just expected and understood that that's how people communicate in this office space. You don't really question it. You don't have to think about it. So, of course, it feels easy and comfortable. And as new staff keep coming in at any level, they get integrated just by naturally being in that space to what this communication looks like. And that's how people start to learn and expect how their day is going to go. And honestly, this works fine for a fair amount of organizations, especially when they're smaller, or at least components of it might work well. And for example, when you're in this new environment now, so maybe you've gone remote, you've merged, you have all more employees, there's no longer these unspoken understandings and expectations to stand on. There is no foundation, there is no ease of everyone just kind of assuming and understanding the same thing. And so now we're in this totally different context. And as a leader, we need to be creating this. So what do you do? Because the challenge is this is often, once again, not intentional, it's not stated, but now we don't have this idea of the shared understanding and expectation. So let's look at some of your examples, RL. Communication in person versus Slack and email and Teams and all of those different things, the technologies that we use to make our lives easier, right? Now, in the office, I suspect there were some ways to communicate that you didn't even have to think about. So maybe you go into Bob's office and you check with him on this report he's doing. It's just a quick chat. Or Susie comes into your office to get some approval for a part of a project she's working on. There was this unwritten expectation that people could meet each other in certain places for certain amounts of time in certain ways. That in-person meeting probably also gave some cues around how urgent this ask might be, how much time you might have for questions. All of those pieces, without having to be said, based on how people saw this happening and experienced it happening, were just there. And of course, with this transition online, you can't do that anymore. So maybe you started by sending more emails. When you first went remote, there was a ton of emails going. And the team, after a couple days, went, oh my God, this is way too many emails about way too many small things. So someone thought, in a very, caring way, oh, why don't we use Slack? And Slack can be for those little questions and email can be for the bigger questions. But there was never a really great discussion or maybe a full understanding from everyone on the team about how much people should check Slack, the urgency of messages that come up on Slack, how big of issues should go on there, how big of questions versus going into an email. And so suddenly this system that does have some good intentions and some ideas behind it is still not clear enough. And it starts building, again, some of this misunderstanding, these kind of muddled expectations, and then probably a bit of like annoyance of how this communication starts happening, maybe even some resentment. And our expectations are all, of course, going to be different, and we don't know what other people expect. And so it's really, really hard to meet those unspoken expectations. So that's just an example of what might be happening with communication. Moving on, RL mentioned there's some trust pieces of it's easier to trust people when they're in the office. And you mentioned being able to support their work. So what were some of the expectations that existed in this previous workspace about how much you checked in, what people were expected to show to you at what points in projects? Again, there's probably some unwritten rules or just understandings that people had about how this was going to go. And of course, you had some expectations about what you were hoping for from the quality of their products, because you have to also put your name behind them, deliver those. And so there was a piece of employee trust was built off of, again, these expectations and how things worked. And it can be harder to let your employees be autonomous and do what they're hired for and where their expertise is when maybe you don't feel as confident in some of those pieces. And this might even be wrapped up in the piece you mentioned around training not being as good online. Maybe you had some systems for training that over the years you developed the best ways in person where you got the best results and people seem to understand the material most. And you couldn't do that online. So now also in your head is this idea that the training is not as high of quality. Maybe I'm worried about my staff team not fully understanding things as well. And I have to trust them to be more autonomous with how they work, how they complete these projects. Maybe this is going to end up being more work for me as I have to correct things, or maybe the work will be substandard and that will affect our whole team. And so now all these different thoughts are coming in about training and how that affects work and how I can trust my team. Finally, staff meetings you mentioned. And these combine so many pieces about communication and training and expectations of how people show up in work settings. And probably the thing I hear most about staff meetings being online is what you mentioned is people being muted. They don't have their screen on, they're off running errands or doing something else while they're listening to this staff meeting. And the flip side of this, though, which often impacts that, is because there's often this less clear communication, these expectations and understandings aren't quite there in a remote setting, is a lot of teams, when they go remote, go to more meetings or longer meetings or meetings with more people. Because in some ways, it's also actually easier to get a whole bunch of people in a Zoom room than it might have been to get them all in person at the same time. So you have more people in more meetings for longer, but maybe they're less engaged. Or that's the way that you see them as less engaged because their screens are off and you want them to be talking more. And so you think, well, of course, this is going to be better in person. Because when you were in person, people understood the expectation of how much they were supposed to participate, what kind of communication. They wouldn't have been heads down on their phones maybe in the meetings. Hopefully they were engaged in a different way. So when you put all of these pieces together, of course, I was making some assumptions about what these things might look like for examples. But when you put it all together, of course, you would rather communicate in person where, although some of these components might still be unstated and unintentional, you of course understand them better because you're used to them. And of course, you prefer to be able to check in with your team and make sure that training's quality. And of course, you want people to be engaged in staff meetings based on how you previously perceived engagement. And so if you've been at this company for a long time, RL, in leadership positions for a long time, it made a lot of sense that you were probably pretty enmeshed in these previous systems. You found ways to make them work well for you. You understood them, and you were really comfortable with that. And that's not a bad thing. And at the same time, part of what might be happening now is your own self-reflection on, are these pieces my preferences because I'm so comfortable with these systems, or do they actually work better for my team and the organization? So of course, it makes sense that you'd rather have these 2 days that feel comfortable and good versus these other days that feel a little bit off. So what can you do with all of this? Because I realize I've thrown a lot at you. And the first piece is just this reflection. Start thinking, what are my needs in this situation? What are the company needs that I've heard from my executive leaders? And when you start putting those together, is this the only solution? Is in person the only solution and way to get those needs met? Or are there other ways to adapt this way of remote working or hybrid working to also meet those needs? Once you've done that individually, I'd also recommend doing it with your peers and your leadership team to make sure everyone's on the same page. And maybe some of them have also been facing this and came up with some great ideas, or they have even more questions and you have been more challenged, and you can all support each other in that. And just getting clear all together on what communication looks like, what you want from it, what you need from it, and how could you clearly share that with your team so they truly understand remote communication. You can discuss training, you can discuss trust, you can discuss meetings, and what does your leadership team need? And what asks could you make of your team that would help you get to that space, that would make all of these pieces more smooth? And what might you need to do to support them in rolling out some of these differences? And then even better, once that happens, you have this conversation with your team, making sure that they understand it. How are you communicating? How are we going to all work to roll out these suggestions? And maybe they have ideas as well. And just to add one final piece is we always think we communicate more and better to make things clear about what we want from other people than we actually do. And the reality is, we actually communicate very little and have more expectations that people are going to understand things the way we do, have the same kind of expectations, work the same way that we do. And then we get upset when they don't do that because they didn't actually understand some part of our perspective and we didn't understand theirs. So, really taking the time to be very intentional, to be very clear, even if it sounds like you're talking too much, to overstate some of these pieces, helping make sure that everyone's on the same page is going to make a huge difference here. And that's what's going to make having a remote space or having a hybrid space feel as comfortable as having a fully in person space. Maybe not instantly, but that it can get to that point because you're not building all these little annoyances and resentments about how things are different and no one's quite doing things as well. And ultimately, I can't give you an answer as to whether you should be 2 days at home or and 3 days in the office or 2 days in the office and 3 days at home because I don't know your organization. Every organization, even departments and organizations, are going to have different needs and wants. But what I do really want you and encourage you to do is to take this time to really figure out your needs and preferences, how those balance the organizations, and of course, how they balance the employees because the employees have probably enjoyed this hybrid system, this remote system. There's benefits to them. So if you are going to make a change, like adding another day in the office, make sure it's for a really good reason that supports everyone, not just what makes you the most comfortable. And RL, I hope this gave you a lot of great points to consider. I really look forward to continuing our conversation in our meeting. And as a reminder to anyone else, if you have a great story or question you'd like to share, we would love to hear it. You can find the link for that in the description below. And as a thank you for doing that and to make sure I fully answer your question, I'll follow up with a complimentary session to make sure we have really gotten to the meat of the situation. And this show is available if you prefer in podcast form on Friday morning. You can also find the link for that in the description. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us today to reflect on some of these things, how your preferences and ideas and expectations might be playing into the world that you've created at work, the intentionality of your culture. And remember, as we close this, think to yourself this week, what kind of ripples are you going to create?